My son canceled my 80th birthday dinner for a party, so I used my late husband's secret fund to leave and never looked back. I'm Clara Mee Thompson, 80 years old, a woman whose son canceled her milestone birthday dinner for a party, and in doing so accidentally set me free. For a long time I believed my life was a quiet, respectable winding down. A series of predictable days lived in the shadow of a much larger, much louder house. My house, the one I had shared with my late husband Frank, was long gone. In its place, I lived in what my son and his wife graciously called the guest house. It was a small, well-appointed cottage at the edge of their sprawling property, just close enough for them to feel they were fulfilling their familial duty, and just far enough away for me not to be a daily inconvenience. My son, Richard, is a man who measures his worth in square footage and horsepower. He'd done well for himself, climbing the corporate ladder with a determination that left little room for sentiment. His wife, Brenda, was a perfect match. Her priorities were polished, catalog perfect, and rotated seasonally like her designer handbags. I tried to love them for who they were, tried to see the good boy I raised inside the man who checked his stock portfolio during our rare Sunday dinners. But mostly, I just felt like a relic they kept on a shelf, a piece of family history they didn't quite know what to do with. Frank had been gone for 10 years, and with him went the warmth that had filled our lives. Our love was a simple, sturdy thing built on shared laughter and the quiet understanding that comes from decades of partnership. He was a contractor, a man who built things with his hands, and he had built our life with that same care. After he passed, a silence fell over me that I couldn't seem to shake. The world felt too big, too fast, and I felt myself shrinking within it. Richard had suggested selling the family home. "It's too much for you to manage, Mom," he'd said, his voice laced with a practiced concern. "Brenda and I want you close. We'll build you a beautiful little place on our property. You'll never have to worry about a thing." I was lonely and grieving, and the idea of being cared for, of being wanted, was a powerful anesthetic. So I agreed. I watched as they tore down the home Frank had built, the one where we'd raised Richard, and sold the land to a developer. With a fraction of the proceeds, they built my guest house. It was lovely, I suppose. It had all the modern amenities, but it had no memories. It was a sterile, quiet box where I waited for invitations that rarely came. The neglect wasn't a single, dramatic event, but a slow erosion, a death by 1,000 paper cuts. It was in the little things, the constant, subtle reminders that I was an afterthought. I remember one year, on what would have been my 55th wedding anniversary with Frank. I'd spent the day looking at old photographs, my heart a hollow ache in my chest. I had mentioned it to Richard a week prior, hoping for maybe a quiet dinner, a shared memory. The day came and went in silence. That evening, I saw the glow of their patio lights and heard the boisterous laughter of a party. I walked to my window and saw Richard holding court by the grill, Brenda circulating with a tray of cocktails. They were hosting their annual neighborhood barbecue. They had forgotten. Or more likely, they had remembered and simply decided their social obligations were more important. I ate a bowl of soup alone in my silent cottage, the sound of their party a cruel counterpoint to the emptiness of my own home. Another time, Brenda had called me in a flurry. "Clara, we need a huge favor. Our caterer for the fundraiser just canceled. Can you possibly make a few dozen of your famous apple pies? It would be a lifesaver." For 3 days I baked. My small kitchen was covered in flour, my arthritic hands aching from peeling and rolling. I filled my freezer with pies, each one a little piece of my heart, a hope that this offering would earn me a seat at their table, a moment of genuine appreciation. Richard picked them up with a hurried "Thanks, Mom, you're the best," and that was the last I heard of it. I saw photos online later, posted by one of Brenda's friends. There were my pies, beautifully arranged on a dessert table with a little placard that read, "Brenda's homemade apple pies." She had taken the credit. When I gently brought it up, she'd waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, Clara, it was just easier that way. You know how these things are." I didn't know how a person could so casually erase someone else's effort, their love. These moments piled up, one on top of the other, pressing down on me until I felt it was difficult to breathe. I became smaller, quieter. I stopped mentioning anniversaries. I stopped offering to help. I learned to expect nothing, and in doing so, I hoped to shield myself from the constant sting of disappointment. Int meant I told myself they were busy, that their lives were full and complicated, and that their carelessness wasn't a reflection of their love for me. It was a lie, a thin blanket I wrapped around myself against the encroaching cold, but it was the only one I had. My 80th birthday was on the horizon, and despite everything, a foolish, stubborn little seed of hope began to sprout in my heart. An 80th birthday was a milestone. Surely they wouldn't forget that. Surely, for this one day, I would be more than an afterthought. This one day they would remember I was their mother. It was this hope, this final, flickering hope that would lead to my undoing and ultimately my salvation. The week leading up to my birthday was a masterclass in self-delusion. I found myself humming as I watered the small patch of petunias outside my door. I planned my outfit in my head, a deep blue dress I'd bought years ago but never had the occasion to wear. It was the color of the evening sky just after the sun has set, the color of possibilities. Each morning I would look across the manicured lawn towards the big house, waiting for a sign, a confirmation that they were as excited as I was. On Monday, Brenda swept by on her way to a yoga class, her car crunching on the gravel path. She rolled down the window, sunglasses perched on her head. "Clara, big day on Saturday, don't you worry about a thing, we've got it all handled." She didn't stop the car, just called out as she drove away, but it was enough. "We've got it all handled." The words echoed in my mind, a sweet promise. I imagined a quiet, elegant restaurant, maybe the one downtown with the white tablecloths and the soft piano music Frank and I used to love. I imagined Richard pulling out my chair and Brenda smiling a genuine, uncomplicated smile. On Wednesday, Richard called. It was a rare, unscheduled call and my heart leaped. "Hey Mom, just wanted to check in. You doing okay for the big day?" "Oh yes, dear, I'm very much looking forward to it," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "Great, great. Listen, Brenda and I will pop over on Saturday morning with your gift before we head out for the day, and then we'll pick you up for dinner at 7. Sound good?" "It sounds wonderful, Richard, truly." "Okay, talk then," and he was gone. Before we head out for the day, the phrase snagged in my thoughts for a moment. Where were they going? But I pushed it away. They had their own lives, of course. All that mattered was the evening, dinner at 7. It became my mantra, the anchor for all my hopes. That Saturday morning arrived, bright and clear. I was up with the sun, the nervous energy of a schoolgirl bubbling inside me. At 10 o'clock sharp, just as he'd promised, Richard and Brenda appeared at my door. Brenda was holding a large, flat box wrapped in shimmering gold paper. "Happy birthday, Clara," she chirped, air-kissing the space beside my cheek. Richard gave my shoulder a brisk, awkward pat. 80 years, huh, Mom? That's really something." They stepped inside, their presence seeming to fill my small living room, making it feel even smaller. They couldn't stay long, they explained. They had an appointment, something for a charity auction Brenda was organizing. I nodded, trying to look understanding. "Open your gift," Brenda urged, gesturing to the box. I carefully undid the ribbon and lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in layers of tissue paper, was a pashmina shawl. It was a beautiful thing, woven in shades of gray and silver and impossibly soft. It was also incredibly expensive. The little tag from a high-end boutique was still attached, and it was completely, utterly impersonal. It was the kind of gift you buy for a person you don't really know, a business associate, a distant aunt. It was safe, elegant, and had required no thought at all. "It's lovely," I said, the words feeling like dust in my mouth. I forced a smile. "Thank you both so much." "We thought of you immediately when we saw it," Brenda lied smoothly. "It's so elegant." They stayed for another 10 minutes, making small talk about the weather and the terrible traffic on the interstate. Richard kept glancing at his watch. Then, with another round of air kisses and shoulder pats, they were gone. "See you at 7, Richard called over his shoulder as they hurried to their car. I closed the door and stood in the silence of my cottage, the shawl draped over my armchair. It was a beautiful object, but it felt cold to the touch. It wasn't a gift born of love or knowledge of me. I loved bright colors, sunflower yellows, poppy reds. I loved gardening and books and the smell of baking bread. This gray, somber shawl felt like a costume for the role they wanted me to play, the quiet, dignified old woman who didn't cause a fuss. Still, I clung to the promise of dinner. Dinner would be different. Dinner would be where they would talk to me, ask me questions about my life, share stories. The G. If didn't matter, their time was the real gift I craved. I spent the afternoon in a state of quiet anticipation. I had a long bath, did my hair, and carefully applied a touch of lipstick. At 5 o'clock, I took out the blue dress. It felt wonderful to slip it on, the fabric cool against my skin. I fastened the clasp on the simple pearl necklace Frank had given me for our 40th anniversary. Looking at my reflection, I saw not just an old woman, but a woman with a history, a woman who had loved and been loved. For a few hours, I allowed myself to believe that my son and his wife would see her, too. I sat in my armchair, the gray shawl untouched beside me, and I waited. 6 o'clock came and went. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in strokes of orange and purple. The light in my cottage softened and the shadows grew long. I smoothed the fabric of my dress over my knees for the 10th time, my palms damp. My stomach was a tight knot of anticipation and a familiar, creeping dread. It was the dread of the perpetually disappointed. At 6:30, my own internal monologue started to churn. Maybe they're running late. The traffic can be bad on a Saturday. Maybe they decided on an earlier reservation and forgot to tell me. I reasoned with myself, building plausible scenarios to hold the anxiety at bay. I was an expert at this, at constructing flimsy defenses against the truth. At 6:45, I stood up and walked to the window, peering across the lawn to their house. It was quiet. No cars in the driveway except for their 2 sedans, no lights on downstairs. A cold knot formed in my stomach. They weren't home. 7 o'clock, the time we were supposed to be leaving. The grandfather clock in my living room, one of the few pieces I'd kept from the old house, chimed the hour. Each chime was a leaden blow against my heart. Silence. The house across the lawn remained dark. 7:15. My hope, which had been a flickering candle all day, was now sputtering, drowning in a pool of wax. I sat back down, my beautiful blue dress feeling like a costume for a play that had been canceled. I felt a foolish, hot shame. How could I, at 80 years old, still be so naive? How could I still allow myself to be hurt by the predictable patterns of their behavior? At 7:30, my phone finally rang. It was Richard. My hand trembled as I answered. Hello. Mom, hey, listen, I am so sorry. His voice was rushed, strained. Something's come up, something unavoidable. We're not going to be able to make it to dinner tonight. I sank back into my chair, the receiver cold against my ear. I said nothing. Mom, are you there? He asked, a hint of impatience in his tone. Yes, Richard, I'm here, I managed to say, my own voice a stranger's whisper. Is everything all right? Yeah, everyone's fine. It's a work thing. A client flew in unexpectedly. We have to entertain them. There's no getting out of it. We feel terrible. A work thing, a client. The excuse was so bland, so corporate, so utterly believable in its thoughtlessness. And then I heard it. In the background, through the phone, I heard Brenda's voice, not faint but clear, and she wasn't talking about work. She was laughing. Tell her we'll reschedule, she called out, her voice bright with excitement. And don't forget to pack your swim trunks. The spa at the resort is supposed to be divine. Swim trunks, a resort, the spa. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The air left my lungs in a silent rush. It wasn't a client, it wasn't a work emergency. It was a weekend getaway. They had lied. They had packed their bags and left for a trip with friends, leaving me sitting here in my birthday dress, waiting for a dinner that was never going to happen. They hadn't just forgot, they had made a deliberate choice. A trip with their friends was more important than their mother's 80th birthday. "Mom, I'll make it up to you, I promise," Richard was saying, his voice now sounding hollow and false. "We'll do something nice next week." Next week, the perpetual next week that never came. A wave of something cold and hard washed over me. It wasn't just sadness, it was rage. A quiet, profound rage that burned away the fog of hope and delusion I'd been living in for a decade. "No, Richard," I said, and my voice was steady. It was shockingly clear. "You won't." "What, Mom? Don't be like that." "Have a wonderful time at the resort," I said, and I hung up the phone. I sat in the deepening twilight, the silence of the room roaring in my ears. The betrayal was so complete, so callous, it was almost sublime. It was a perfect crystalline monument to their indifference. For a few minutes, I didn't move. I just stared at the wall, seeing not the floral wallpaper but the last 10 years of my life in stark, painful clarity. The little compromises, the swallowed disappointments, the endless, lonely waiting. Then a new thought took hold, fierce and defiant. No, I would not sit here in the dark and let them reduce me to this. This was my 80th birthday. I had dressed for a celebration, and a celebration was what I would have, even if I was the only guest. I stood up, my back straight. I walked to the hall closet and took out my coat. I grabbed my purse and my car keys. I didn't know where I was going exactly, but I knew I was not staying here. I was going to that fancy restaurant with the white tablecloths. I was going to have dinner, alone. The drive into town was a blur. My mind was a strange cocktail of white-hot anger and icy calm. I drove Frank's old Buick, a car I barely used anymore, its big, boat-like body a comfort around me. The engine hummed a familiar, steady tune. At every stoplight, I'd catch my reflection in the rearview mirror, a woman with carefully coiffed hair, pearl necklace, and a stricken look in her eyes. I looked like a ghost attending her own wake. The restaurant was called the Gilded Spoon. It was exactly as I had imagined, hushed, elegant, a sanctuary of civility. The warm glow from its windows spilled onto the sidewalk, a beacon of cheer. As I pushed open the heavy oak door, a wave of warmth and the delicious smell of roasted garlic and fresh bread washed over me. The hostess, a young woman with a kind smile, approached. "Good evening, madam. Do you have a reservation?" The question hung in the air. A reservation for one, a party of one, an island of one. "No," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I was supposed to be meeting my family for my birthday, but they were detained." The hostess's smile faltered for a second, replaced by a look of professional pity that was almost worse than scorn. "Of course, right this way." She led me through the dining room. It was filled with the low murmur of conversation and the clinking of silverware. Couples leaned in close, sharing secrets over wine. A large family was celebrating at a round table in the corner, a pile of presents on an empty chair. Everyone was paired up, part of a whole, and then there was me. She seated me at a small table for two, nestled in an alcove. It felt like being placed on a stage. "Your waiter will be with you shortly," she said, placing a single menu on the table. "And happy birthday." I watched her walk away, her sympathy trailing behind her like a scent. I felt the eyes of the other diners on me. They weren't staring, not rudely, but I could feel their sidelong glances, their curiosity. The old woman all dressed up and alone. I wanted to shrink, to disappear into the plush velvet of the booth. But then that core of anger, that new hard thing inside me, pushed back. I would not be ashamed. I had every right to be here. I picked up the menu, my hands trembling so much the words swam before my eyes. A young waiter arrived, earnest and polite. "Good evening, madam. Can I get you something to drink?" "I'll have a glass of your house red," I said. It was what Frank always ordered. When he brought the wine, I took a sip. It was rich and dry, and it burned a trail down to the pit of my stomach. I ordered the salmon, a dish I loved but rarely made for myself. It felt decadent, an act of rebellion. As I waited for my food, I watched the other tables. I saw a young man propose to his girlfriend, the whole restaurant breaking into applause. I saw a father patiently cutting his daughter's steak into tiny pieces. I saw love, connection, and belonging everywhere I looked. And the loneliness, a feeling I had lived with for years as a dull, constant companion, became a sharp physical pain. It was a pressure in my chest, a thickness in my throat. My salmon arrived, perfectly cooked, but I could barely taste it. I moved the food around on my plate, taking small, mechanical bites. For dessert, I did something I hadn't planned. "It's my 80th birthday," I told the waiter, the words catching in my throat. "Could I possibly have a small piece of your chocolate lava cake with a candle?" He looked at me with such genuine compassion that it almost broke me. "It would be my pleasure," he said softly. He returned a few minutes later with a small, decadent cake, a single tall candle flickering in its center. He set it down in front of me. "From all of us at the Gilded Spoon," he said, "Happy birthday, Mrs. Thompson." He must have overheard my name when the hostess seated me. The simple act of being seen, of being named, was my undoing. As he walked away, I stared at that tiny flame, a solitary point of light in the dim restaurant. It was me, a single, flickering light in the vast darkness of my life, and I started to cry. Not loud, messy sobs, but silent, hot tears that rolled down my cheeks and dripped onto the white tablecloth. I made no sound. I just sat there in my beautiful dress at a table for two and wept for my lost husband, for my thoughtless son, for the years of quiet invisibility, and for the hopeful, foolish woman I had been Jus. A few hours ago. I paid the bill, leaving a generous tip for the kind waiter, and walked out of the restaurant with as much dignity as I could muster. The cool night air was a shock after the warmth of the dining room. I got into my car, the cavernous interior of the Buick feeling like a tomb. And then the dam broke. I leaned my forehead against the steering wheel and sobbed. I cried until my body ached, until my throat was raw. I cried out all the disappointment, all the hurt, all the lonely nights and forgotten anniversaries. When the tears finally subsided, I was left with a profound, terrifying emptiness. The drive home was a fog. But when I reached the turnoff for Richard and Brenda's property, I did something strange. I didn't turn. I kept driving straight past their manicured entrance, past the dark windows of my own guest house. I drove to the back of the property, down a rutted, overgrown lane I hadn't used in years. At the end of it, obscured by weeds and shadowed by an old oak tree, was the one building Richard hadn't bothered to tear down, Frank's old workshop. It was a simple, barn-like structure, its red paint faded and peeling. I parked the car, its headlights cutting a swath through the darkness, illuminating a decade of neglect. I didn't know why I had come here. I just felt drawn to it, the last piece of Frank that was truly left. The door was stuck, but I put my shoulder into it, and it groaned open with a screech of rusty hinges. I stepped inside into the darkness and breathed in the ghost of him. The air was thick with the scent of sawdust, oil, and his pipe tobacco. It was the smell of my husband. It was the smell of home. I fumbled along the wall until my fingers found the old, stiff light switch. With a flick and a hum, a single bare bulb overhead sputtered to life, casting a weak yellow glow over the room. The workshop was just as he had left it. His workbench stood against the far wall, its surface scarred with the history of 1,000 projects. Tools hung in neat outlines on the pegboard behind it. Sawdust lay in a fine, undisturbed blanket over everything. It was a shrine to a life of purpose, a life of creation. I ran my hand over the rough surface of the workbench, my fingers tracing the gouges and nicks. Each one told a story. Here was where he'd built Richard's first Pinewood Derby car. Here was where he'd repaired the leg of our dining room table after a particularly raucous holiday dinner. Here was where he had taught me how to properly hold a hammer. My grief, which had been a wild, raging storm in the car, softened into a gentle, aching sorrow. My eyes scanned the shelves crowded with jars of screws and nails, old paint cans, and stacks of wood scraps. And then I saw it. Tucked away on the highest shelf, covered in a thick layer of dust, was a metal strongbox. It was an old army green box, the kind Frank used to keep important papers in. I had never seen this one before. Curiosity got the better of me. I dragged over a rickety wooden stool, my blue dress getting smudged with dust, and carefully climbed up. The box was heavy. I wrestled it down from the shelf, a small cloud of dust exploding around me. I carried it over to the workbench and wiped the top with the sleeve of my coat. It wasn't locked. With trembling hands, I lifted the rusty clasps and opened the lid. Inside, it didn't hold deeds or insurance papers. The first thing I saw was a stack of old travel brochures, their colors faded with time. They were for coastal towns in Maine: Bar Harbor, Kennebunkport, Ogunquit, places Frank and I had always dreamed of visiting, of perhaps even retiring to one day. When the time is right, he'd always say, but the time was never right. There was always a mortgage to pay, a son to put through college, a life to be lived right where we were. Beneath the brochures was a thick, leather-bound journal. I opened it. It was Frank's handwriting, neat and deliberate. It was a journal not of his days but of his dreams. He had filled the pages with sketches of a small, shingled cottage by the sea. He'd drawn floor plans, designed a garden, even made a list of names for a small fishing boat he wanted to buy. It was a whole life, imagined and planned out on paper, a secret world he had built for us. Tears welled in my eyes again, but these were different. These were tears of love, of a profound connection that death had not severed. He had kept our dream alive, even if only in these hidden pages. And then I saw what was underneath the journal. It was cash, stacks and stacks of cash bundled neatly with rubber bands. $100 bills, 50s, 20s. I lifted one of the bundles. It was far more than just pocket money. I started pulling the bundles out, my heart hammering against my ribs. Tucked at the very bottom was a simple white envelope with my name, Clara, written on it in his familiar script. My fingers shook as I tore it open. The letter inside was short. My dearest Clara, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone and you found my little hideaway. I called this my adventure fund. Every time I had a little extra from a job, a little cash on the side, I tucked it away in here. It wasn't much at first, but the years have a way of adding things up. I always told you we'd have our adventure someday, that we'd see the ocean from our own porch. I'm sorry I couldn't be the one to take you there, but that doesn't mean you can't go. This is for you, my love, for your adventure. Don't you dare just put it in the bank. Go build something, go live, don't wait for the time to be right, make it right. I love you always. Yours, Frank. I clutched the letter to my chest, the paper absorbing my tears. The money, the journal, the letter, it wasn't just an inheritance. It was a key, it was permission, it was Frank from across the great divide telling me to stop waiting. A spark ignited in the cold, empty space inside me. It was a tiny, terrifying, exhilarating idea. What if I did? What if I took this money and I just left? What if I found a little cottage in Maine and built the life he had sketched out in his journal? The idea was insane. I was 80 years old. I was supposed to be living quietly in my guest house, waiting for my son to call. But what kind of life was that? I looked around the dusty workshop at the tools that had built a life, and I looked at the box full of dreams. For the first time in a decade, I felt a flicker of my old self, the woman who had stood by Frank's side, who had faced challenges and built a family. She was still in there, buried under years of grief and neglect. The first thing I did the next morning was call Arthur Finch. Arthur had been Frank's best friend since they were boys and my friend for just as long. A retired contractor himself, he was as sharp and sturdy as the oak trees he loved to plant. He was a widower too, and he understood loneliness in a way no one else did. Arthur, I said, my voice raspy, I need your help, and I need you to not tell a soul, especially not Richard. I told him everything, The birthday dinner, the restaurant, the workshop, the box, he listened patiently without interruption. When I was finished, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Well, he finally said, a slow smile in his voice. "Frank, you old son of a gun, of course I'll help you, Clara. What's the plan?" Just hearing him say those words, "What's the plan?" made it feel real. Over the next 2 weeks, Arthur became my co-conspirator. We met secretly at a coffee shop in the next town over. We counted the money on my kitchen table while Richard and Brenda were at work. It was over $80,000, a fortune Frank had squirreled away with love. Arthur, with his practical, no-nonsense mind, helped me formulate the steps. First, secure the money. We opened a new bank account in my name at a different bank, one Richard knew nothing about. Second, find a place. We spent hours online looking at real estate listings in small Maine towns. We found it a week later, a small, neglected fixer-upper cottage in a town called Port Clyde. It was right on the water with a rickety porch and peeling paint, but the view was breathtaking. It looked just like the one in Frank's drawings. "It needs a lot of work, Clara," Arthur warned, peering at the photos over his glasses. "Frank left me his tools," I said, a smile touching my lips for what felt like the first time in ages. "And I have you on speed dial." He grinned. "That you do." I made an offer on the cottage through a local realtor, using a portion of the cash as a down payment. All the paperwork was done electronically. It was terrifying and thrilling. All the while, life at the guest house continued as normal. Richard and Brenda returned from their work trip, full of fake apologies and a cheap bouquet of supermarket flowers. They suggested we reschedule my birthday dinner for the following week. I politely agreed, knowing it was a dinner I would never attend. They were completely oblivious, wrapped up in their own world. They didn't notice the fire in my eyes or the secret smile I now carried. They didn't notice I was no longer waiting, I was planning. The day the moving truck was scheduled to arrive felt like the dawn of a new world. I had packed in secret, late at night after the lights in the main house had gone out. I wasn't taking much. A few boxes of clothes, Frank's tools, the grandfather clock, and the strongbox with his journal. The rest, the impersonal furniture, the gray shawl still draped over the chair, I was leaving behind. It was part of a life that was no longer mine. I had told the moving company to come at 9 in the morning, a time I knew Brenda would be at her Pilates class and Richard would be at the office. Arthur arrived a little earlier, his old pickup truck rattling down the lane. He gave me a firm hug. "You ready for this, Cla?" "Raw?" he asked, his eyes twinkling. "I'm terrified," I admitted. "And I've never been more ready for anything in my life." The movers were efficient and discreet. They loaded my few possessions into the back of the truck with practiced ease. The grandfather clock was the last thing to go, swaddled in blankets like a precious infant. As they were securing the final straps, a sleek black SUV pulled up, its tires spitting gravel. It was Brenda. Her class must have ended early. She got out of the car, a confused frown on her face as she took in the scene. Me, Arthur, the large moving truck parked outside my guest house. "Clara, what on earth is going on?" she asked, her tone more accusatory than curious. "Who are these men?" "They're movers, Brenda," I said calmly. "Movers? Why, are you getting new furniture? You should have told me. I have a decorator who could have helped." "No," I said, taking a deep breath. "I'm moving out." Brenda stared at me, her perfectly made-up face a mask of disbelief. Then she laughed, a short, sharp bark. "Moving out? Don't be ridiculous. Where would you go?" The condescension in her voice, the utter certainty that I had no life, no options beyond the world she and Richard had created for me, was the final confirmation that I was doing the right thing. Before I could answer, Richard's car came speeding down the driveway. Brenda must have called him. He screeched to a halt behind the moving truck, blocking its exit, and got out, his face flushed with anger. "Mom, what is this? Arthur, what are you doing here?" Brenda called me in a panic. She said, "You're talking nonsense about moving." "It's not nonsense, Richard," I said, my voice even. Arthur stood silently by my side, a solid, reassuring presence. "I've sold most of the furniture and I'm moving to Maine." "Maine?" He looked from me to the truck and back again as if he couldn't process the words. "Maine? Have you lost your mind? You can't move to Maine, you're 80 years old." "My age is a fact, Richard, not a diagnosis," I replied, hearing a strength in my own voice that surprised me. "This is Arthur's fault," he snarled, turning on his old family friend. "You put this ridiculous idea in her head, you're taking advantage of her." "Your mother," Arthur said, his voice low and dangerous, "is one of the most capable women I have ever known. The only people taking advantage of her around here are you and your wife, who couldn't be bothered to show up for her 80th birthday." The shot hit its mark. Richard flinched. Brenda had the grace to look away. "That was a misunderstanding," Richard blustered. "This is about something else. This is about money, isn't it? She can't afford this. You're trying to get her money." "Actually, son," I said, stepping forward, "I can afford it. Dad left me what he called an adventure fund. It turns out he was a much better saver than either of us knew." The look on their faces was a sight to behold. Shock followed by a dawning, greedy realization, then outright panic. Their minds were visibly calculating, gears turning. Money, an inheritance they knew nothing about, an inheritance that was now packed in a strongbox on a truck heading for another state far beyond their reach. "Mother, you can't be serious," Brenda said, her voice dripping with fake concern. "An old woman like you, all alone in a new state, it's not safe. You should stay here with family. We can help you manage your finances." Manage your finances, there it was, the truth stripped bare of all pretense. "Thank you for your concern, Brenda," I said, looking her straight in the eye. "But I have been managing my own finances for 60 years. I think I can handle it. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have a long drive ahead of us." I nodded to the movers, who had been watching the family drama with detached interest. I handed the driver the address in Port Clyde. Richard stood in front of the truck, his arms crossed. "I'm not letting you do this. It's irresponsible. As your son, I forbid it." I walked right up to him, my son who towered over me, my son who had made me feel so small for so long. I looked up into his angry, confused face. "You are my son, Richard, but you do not own me. You don't get to forbid me from living my own life. I waited 10 years for you to see me, to value me. I'm done waiting. Now, please move your car." Something in my tone, something in my eyes must have finally broken through his arrogance. He saw that I was not the meek, compliant mother he was used to. He saw a stranger. After a long, tense moment, he slowly, resentfully stepped aside. Arthur helped me into the passenger seat of his pickup. He was driving with me the whole way to make sure I got settled. As we pulled out of the driveway, I looked back one last time. Richard and Brenda stood there, two small figures on their perfectly manicured lawn, looking utterly bewildered. They weren't waving, they were just staring at the space where the guest house and their compliant old mother used to be. I didn't feel sadness, I didn't feel regret. I just felt the sweet, clean, exhilarating rush of freedom. I turned my face forward toward the open road and the sea that was waiting for me, and I never looked back. The journey to Maine was a pilgrimage. For 2 days, Arthur and I drove, listening to old music on the radio and talking more than we had in years. With every mile that passed, I felt the weight of the last decade sloughing off me like a heavy coat. The air itself seemed to change as we crossed the state line, becoming crisp and laced with the briny promise of the sea. Port Clyde was a postcard, a working fishing village with a rugged, unpolished beauty. Our realtor, a kind woman named Sarah, met us at the cottage. It was, as Arthur had predicted, in a state of glorious disrepair. The shingles were weathered gray, the porch sagged to one side, and the garden was a riot of weeds. But the view from that sagging porch was worth more than all of Richard's stocks and bonds combined. It was a panoramic vista of the harbor, with lobster boats bobbing on the waves and the cry of gulls echoing in the air. It was Frank's journal come to life. "It's perfect," I breathed. The first few months were hard work, the kind of hard work that makes your bones ache and your soul sing. Arthur stayed for 2 weeks, helping me with the heavy lifting, stabilizing the porch, patching the roof, and showing me how to use the more intimidating of Frank's power tools. After he left, promising to visit soon, the real work began. I learned to plaster walls. I spent days on my hands and knees, sanding the old pine floors until they glowed. I painted the walls in colors of sea glass and sunshine. Every repaired window, every newly planted flower in the reclaimed garden was a victory. I was not just restoring a cottage, I was rebuilding myself. My neighbors were not like the residents of Richard's gated community. They were fishermen, artists, and shopkeepers. They were curious but respectful. My immediate neighbor was a young sculptor named Maya who often worked in her yard, surrounded by pieces of driftwood and metal. She brought me a pot of her famous fish chowder my first week. An old, grizzled lobsterman named Silas, who lived down the lane, saw me struggling with a broken fence post one afternoon. He grumbled something about summer people, but then spent the next 2 hours fixing the entire fence line, refusing any payment other than a cup of coffee. Slowly, I became part of the town's fabric. I joined the local quilting circle. I volunteered at the library. I learned the names of the boats in the harbor. My little cottage, once a derelict eyesore, became a beacon of warmth and light. Maya would come over for tea and Silas would drop off fresh-caught haddock on my porch. I had friends. I had purpose. I would wake up in the morning to the sound of the gulls, make myself a cup of coffee, and sit on my sturdy new porch, watching the sun rise over the water. And I would feel a profound sense of peace, a happiness so deep and real it was almost overwhelming. About 6 months after I arrived, a familiar, sleek black car pulled into my gravel driveway. Richard and Brenda got out. They were dressed in expensive casual wear that screamed vacation, but their faces were tight with anxiety. They looked around at the transformed cottage, the blooming garden, their expressions a mixture of astonishment and resentment. "Mother," Richard said, forcing a smile, "you look well." "I am well, Richard," I said, not moving from my rocking chair on the porch. "We were worried sick," Brenda chimed in, her voice oozing insincere sweetness. "We tried calling, but your number was disconnected." "I have a new number," I said simply, "for my new life." They exchanged a look. This was not going according to their plan. They had come here expecting to find me miserable, lonely, and desperate to be rescued. They had come to lure me back and, more importantly, to get control of what they now knew was my money. "This is all very rustic," Brenda said, gesturing vaguely at my beautiful wild garden. "But surely you must be lonely. It's time to come home, Clara, back to your family." "I am home," I said, my gaze sweeping over the harbor, "and I have a family here. Maya is bringing me to a potluck tonight. Silas is taking me out on his boat tomorrow to check his lobster traps." Richard's facade finally cracked. Mom, this is insane. This isn't a life, it's a fantasy. You have responsibilities, you have us, we're your family. I finally stood up and looked at them, at these two people who had caused me so much pain. I felt no anger, no bitterness, only a distant, quiet pity. For 10 years you were my only family, I said, my voice clear and strong. And for 10 years I was invisible to you. You didn't want a mother, you wanted a dependent, a quiet little old lad. Why, who wouldn't be any trouble? The woman you see now, the one who fixed this porch and planted these flowers and has a dinner to get to tonight with her friends, she doesn't fit into that little box. I'm sorry if that inconveniences you. I walked to my front door and placed my hand on the knob. It was a long drive. I'm sure you're tired. There's a lovely inn back in town. I suggest you get a room for the night before you head back. They were speechless. They stared at me, then at the house, then at each other, their faces a thunderous portrait of thwarted greed. They had no power here. Their currency, guilt, obligation, disapproval was worthless in this new economy of joy and self-reliance I had built. After a long, silent moment, they turned, got back in their expensive car, and drove away, leaving behind nothing but a cloud of dust. I watched them go until their car disappeared around the bend. Then I turned, walked into my bright, warm, beautiful home, and closed the door. I learned something important in my 80th year. I learned that family is not just about blood, it's about who shows up. It's about who sees you, who cherishes you, and who helps you fix your fence when it's broken. I learned that it is never, ever too late to pick up your husband's old tools and build a new life. You can spend your whole life waiting for others to give you permission to be happy, or you can write that permission slip yourself. My greatest adventure didn't start with a trip to a foreign land. It started with a lonely dinner, a box of old dreams, and the decision to finally choose myself. And that's my story. Thank you for listening.